When we look back at how the Golden State Warriors built their dynasty, it seems completely organic. You draft the Splash Brothers, you sign Andre Iguodala, you move Draymond to center. It all came together so beautifully and so organically. And then eventually the team lured Kevin Durant to join them and they became this juggernaut. However, the road to creating this super team was littered with potholes that could have derailed the entire thing at any moment. It's really easy to forget that the Golden State Warriors faced several roster dilemmas throughout the 2010s. And not only did they face those dilemmas, but they managed to make the right choice almost at every turn. In hindsight, these moves are all no-brainers. Like, they're decisions we look back on it and go, duh, yeah, of course you do that. But at the time, there were a lot of choices that were really difficult for the franchise to make. This doesn't even factor in the team's decision to replace then head coach Mark Jackson with Steve Kerr after the former had just won 51 games in 2013-2014. Even the players were skeptical about that move at the time. However, as we know, it did work out pretty well. The team obviously won 4 titles, went to the finals for 6 straight years. It's worked out extremely well, better than they could have hoped for. However, there is no way in hell we get a Golden State Warriors dynasty had they not nailed some of the most difficult and daunting roster decisions that they had faced. Somewhere out there in an alternate universe, there is a really awful Golden State Warriors team that managed to make the wrong move at every juncture and just totally crapped out. And that is what we're going to look at today. Steph Curry or Monta Ellis? Yeah, it seems like a stupid decision today, but way back in 2012, this was a hot button issue. Let's start with 2 very obvious points. First, back then, nobody really seemed to know what Curry's final form would be in the NBA. Very few, if anyone, was predicted him to turn out the player he became and being the head of this important juggernaut Golden State Warriors franchise. And really, after Curry's first 2 seasons in the league, there were various concerns about him. People weren't sure if his game was going to translate. People weren't sure about his durability. There were question marks, rightly or wrongly, surrounding Steph Curry at that time. Second, it was totally obvious if you watched 3 minutes of Warriors basketball when Ellis and Curry were on the team that these two could not coexist in the same backcourt. Now, there was always talk of a beef between them, but I think that's always been overplayed. There was really they weren't at loggerheads, they weren't rivals by any means. They were just 2 basketball players who were not suited to be playing alongside one another. Plus, Golden State had drafted Klay Thompson, who seemed like a much better fit at guard with one of them, but not both. Monta Ellis was a known commodity. Not only that, the Warriors fan base adored him, and he was one of basketball's best pure scorers at that time. And let's not forget, this was definitely a period in NBA history where we still loved the high volume, low efficiency scorer, although Ellis' efficiency wasn't as terrible as it's made out to be today. And as far as the age goes, Ellis was 26, Curry was 23. There wasn't this huge age gap between them, which made this a difficult decision. There was a case to keep either player, but it was clear one had to go. The overlap in skills and defensive deficiencies of both players meant that it just wasn't going to work. Ultimately, sides started to form within the media and the Warriors fan base. You had Team Monta and you had Team Steph, and they were going at it on talk shows and going at it and calling radio shows, and it was a BFD at that time. And that brings us to March of 2012. Golden State shipped Ellis, Kwame Brown, yeah, he was a Warrior for a minute, and Ekpe Udoh to the Milwaukee Bucks for Andrew Bogut and Steven Jackson. Now here's where things get interesting. According to Bogut, the Bucks had their pick between Curry or Ellis and chose Ellis. This has since been refuted by then Golden State Warriors general manager Larry Riley, who said it was mostly a negotiating tactic, but we don't really know who to believe in this scenario. It's somewhat plausible that the Bucks decided that they would have rather had Ellis than Curry, and that's why that deal got made. Whatever the case may be, this was clearly the launching point for the Golden State Warriors dynasty, and a decision the franchise did get right. Here's a fun basketball factoid for you. The highest paid player on the 2014-15 Golden State Warriors NBA championship team was David Lee. Obviously, that is not ideal. Alright, so we're going to take a deep dive to a very specific moment in history and actually my personal life to sort of understand the David Lee situation. I remember vividly listening to Damon Bruce on KNBR 680, the Warriors affiliate in San Francisco at the time, and they were discussing David Lee after a game against the Pacers in early January of 2015. I was on my way to the airport. I'd visited my family in the States and was going back to Thailand, and I love sports talk radio, and just something about this take has always stayed with me because I think of the situation, going to the airport, and how a weird take I still find this to be about David Lee, but here goes. Essentially, everyone knew Lee didn't fit in with what Steve Kerr was trying to do with the Warriors at that time. He slowed down the team, he wasn't all that effective. On the other hand, the power forward was the first Golden State All-Star since Latrell Sprewell in 1997, and a lot of people, Bruce included, didn't want to simply dump him off on some hopeless franchise, Sacramento Kings, and see him play his golden years on a loser. So, according to Bruce, if they couldn't find a golden parachute for Lee, it was better to hold on to him, which blows my mind. I still don't fully comprehend this idea that we need to make sure David Lee doesn't play on a loser. But anyway, the Warriors traded Lee and they received Gerald Wallace and Chris Bobb, but Wallace was there for like 20 days because they were going to ship his salary to Philly, who was just acquiring as many assets in the early days of trust the process as they could. So the Sixers shipped out Jason Thompson for salary matching purposes, although Thompson's contract was about $6 or $7 million less than what Wallace was making, and what ended up being worthless pick swap because the Warriors would make the finals the next season, so it didn't even convey, and the Sixers just ate a bunch of money in the hopes that they would get a first-round draft pick, or a better first-round draft pick. Harrison Barnes or Kevin Durant? Yeah, this is a question that once again seems totally dumb and totally stupid, but it was being asked back in 2016. Now, in order to understand sort of the Warriors and Barnes relationship and how much of an affinity the franchise had for them, we have to go back to 2013. The team actively tanked games in hopes that they could draft Barnes, and they spent a fair amount of time and effort in trying to develop him. But when the finals happened in 2016, they sort of fell out of love with him, and they felt the need that they needed another superstar, they needed someone to complement what they had, and it just happened that Kevin Durant was a free agent. Now let's make one thing perfectly clear here. The decision between Durant and Barnes wasn't necessarily a franchise decision because they had decided that Durant was their first choice all along. The choice was more played out in the media and among fans who were really, or at least a group of them, was really connected to Harrison Barnes. The reason media and fans, or select media and fans, felt like keeping Barnes was a better idea is because he was younger, he still had a lot of room to develop, and there were also a lot of questions about just how exactly Durant was going to fit alongside Curry, Thompson, and Draymond. Additionally, you could have made a strong case for the Warriors keeping things together and running it back in 2016-2017. The team had won 73 games that season, it was up 3-1 in the finals. There probably wasn't a huge reason to mix things up, or you could argue that there wasn't a huge reason to mix things up. Given how much the Warriors had invested in Barnes, and given the fact that everyone knew adding Durant was going to be a massive distraction, you can see the case for keeping Barnes over Durant, although it's probably for the best that the Warriors picked Durant. Somewhere out there in the universe is an alternate version of the Warriors dynasty that's probably not even a dynasty. I think even if the team chose Ellis over Curry, they're likely to have won that championship in 2014 and 2015. Ellis was still a really good player at that time, and they had enough talent and what they were doing was good enough that they'd probably get that first championship. After that, things get really dodgy. For starters, Ellis's play fell off a cliff in 2015 and 2016, and he actually was out of the league by 2017, so as we'll see, that sort of impacts things greatly. Now, let's say the Warriors in this scenario still manage to find a taker for David Lee's contract. The situation doesn't really improve all that much. Ultimately, the 2015-2016 Warriors aren't making it to the finals. In all likelihood, they aren't making it to the finals, and that means most likely Kevin Durant doesn't show up at Oracle Arena. This means Barnes sticks around, and the Warriors' 2016-2017 lineup would have looked something like Monta Ellis, who was in his last year, Klay Thompson, Barnes, Draymond Green, and Zaza Pachulia. Now, maybe they end up starting Andre Iguodala, but that's not a championship caliber team either way. Speaking of Iguodala, in this hypothetical, he's not sticking around and signing that contract extension in 2017. And when you factor that along with Ellis now retiring at the end of 2017, the Warriors are probably jumping in the free agency in search of a point guard. Perhaps they make a run at Chris Paul, who did end up with the Rockets that summer. Now, if they don't land him, their best option is either George Hill or a guy like Derrick Rose, or one of any other number of low-cost veteran minimum alternatives. Now, let's say the Warriors keep Curry, but they didn't find a taker for David Lee's contract, or they didn't find a taker who they deemed to be suitable enough for David Lee's contract. Things here also get really messy, especially from a salary cap perspective. Their ability to sign Draymond Green to an extension, and then their ability to even sign Durant without losing Iguodala is probably impossible. The math doesn't necessarily work there. And even in that scenario, had they locked down Draymond to an extension, it's possible that they don't get Durant and lose Barnes anyway. Each of these roster decisions built the Golden State Warriors dynasty, and they made the exact right decision each time. Had Golden State done anything different with even one of these decisions, who knows what that dynasty ends up looking like. And really, it would probably end up looking quite bad. That does it for our look at the bizarro alternate universe Golden State Warriors dynasty, or lack thereof, we'll say. For the Touchback, I'm Cheyenne Hollis, and make sure you always hashtag take it out to the 25.